Oh, wow. This is the first time I've been live for a long time. So let's see if anybody is here. Just checking. Hopefully you can hear me. So it says that's on. And maybe if it's just me, it's also fine. But maybe someone will say hi from in the audience. I'm going to just double check that I can see myself. I think I should be able to. Let me have a look. This is always the fun part. Yep, I can see myself. Right, good stuff. Now let me close this tab. So feel free to say hello if anybody is out there. It's probably an awkward time. People getting ready for work, getting the kids ready, getting yourself ready. But I still wanted to go live for the first time this year. Somehow, I've been reading this everywhere. People are like, yeah, the January blues has somehow transferred over to the February blues. I'm hoping that's not the case for everyone. But there's definitely been the feeling of time flying by and the month of January just seeming to be a blah month, because as soon as we hit the year, then everything moved across. But today I want you to talk about representation, but it's not really a formula, but let's make it sound amazing. This formula around it's only representation plus influence that equals change. And recently, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, I posted about a Bloomberg article that was saying, there are more women on the boards of banks, but they're still not seeing any power shifts, any power dynamics that's making it possible for them to create the change that is needed. And then I was also thinking about another post that I did yesterday, which was around The Gilded Age, this new show. And one of the main actresses, I've forgotten her, it's just her name's just slipped my mind, but how she used her voice, not just to, she wasn't just there as an actress who was Black. She was also supported by other women who could then make changes to the story, to the outcome, so that Black women were represented in a way that they felt they were doing justice to us, but also that went on to educate, other members of staff that unfortunately were not, it doesn't have to be necessarily, but that didn't have the experience, had neither the experience nor the foresight nor the wherewithal to create rounded Black characters. And I think this is the thing that, companies also need to focus on is when you're thinking about representation, how are you also ensuring that the people who, it's great to have a seat at the table, but do you have a voice at the table? Do you have not just a right to vote, but a right to create policy at this table? Do you have the power to push this through, even if nobody else agrees with what you're saying because they don't share the same perspective? And how do you do that? How do you ensure that that happens? How do you ensure that you create a scenario of increased representation? I think, what did they say? Usually you need three seats on a board of 10 to be able to kind of realistically affect change. So if that's the case, when we're looking at women on boards, or we're looking at increasing representation for a particular demographic of women, let's say age-wise, race, how are companies, how are you making sure that when you're putting them in this position, they're not the only one? Because representation matters only so far. Representation gets us to that point of seeing somebody, and in many cases for the future generation, providing a role model, because it creates the sense of possibilities for those who are behind them. But a wonderful conversation I had yesterday evening is, for every generation, our role is to push the dial, push the envelope further for gender equality for the next generation. So it can't just be about representation, it also has to be representation and influence. It has to be putting women not just in positions of visibility, but positions of power to be able to create the needed change. Not only that, but the positions of power that are being created, it almost has to be an unquestioned change. And when I say unquestioned, I don't mean in terms of its impact on the business as a whole, its impact on profits. I mean it is in the validity of the comment has to be accepted. And it shouldn't be the case of, and this is what usually happens when there's only one person, one woman, nine men. And this is not always the case. So, we do speak in generalizations, but one woman, nine men. A woman brings up an issue that's faced by women rather. Then the nine men go, maybe that's not as important because it's not as important to them. Because in many cases, you don't know what you don't know. But at the same time, in this particular situation, she is then outnumbered, outweighed, and her view not taken as seriously because the majority are not experiencing these problems. Ergo, it's not that serious. Therefore, we don't have to do anything about it. And this is why this part of representation, companies have to be, leaders have to be very aware that the representation has to come with influence and power. You have to empower those in those positions to be able not just to speak up, because speaking up, as we've seen already, I think everybody's spoken out or fatigued by speaking up. The point is, once I've spoken up, what is the next step? I've spoken up, so now do I actually have the possibility of making change? I've spoken out, so how can this then be implemented as part of a strategy? How will I see this change in my department? How will I see this change on a wider basis? Because ultimately, we can't keep using representation and saying, hey, I've got a seat. This woman has a seat. So we've done a good job. That's the first part. The second part is, how do we then elevate and amplify her voice to make sure what it is she needs is being, and when I say she's representing, a broader she, a global she, what it is she needs to be able to thrive in this environment. Because when you think about it, there's also that part around when you create this representative seat, right? There's a part of education of those who don't belong to the demographic for one reason or another. It's also a learning experience to understand why. So part of, and it's not for the person who belongs to that group to have to always do the education. This can be engaging external parties, but the concept of an ecosystem lens and getting also to this point of influence is bringing everybody along on the journey, so that as the shifts are being made, it's not that those who feel displaced are ignored, but their concerns, problems, issues, opinions are heard in conjunction with the changes. Because that's the other part, right? If you're the only one, or, thank you. Someone said I'm standing in for my mother. Thank you, Eddie Omi. If you're the only one, that's a lot to bear on your shoulders, and you almost feel excluded because you're having to represent, you're having to educate, and then you're also having to fight to be heard and to then create and influence and influence the outcome, which is a lot for one person to do. And this is why when you're looking at it, I wish I had a whiteboard now. That is something I'm going to try and figure out. This is why when you're kind of looking at it, it's almost like here is the representative. What does the representative need in this situation to succeed? Well, if everybody else in this group does not belong to this demographic, then we need to add education as an overlay here to educate everybody as to why we need to have representation from this particular group. Sometimes it's obvious, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be education around it, about the systemic injustices, about the systemic sexism, about the systemic inequalities that has led to this point. Then the next question is, what will be needed of you as a person supporting this representative? That's another learning point. How do we then make sure that everybody understands the roles that they need to play and the purpose of this representative within this group? Because it's not just representation for the sake of it, that you have a woman on the board, that you have a Black woman in your leadership team. These women are standing in the place of other women who haven't felt like they've been heard. So, what is their purpose? Because it should be clear as to what their purpose is so that they can play their role as successfully as possible. But everybody also within that construct needs to understand their roles too. And it's not to say, this is let's say, a partially romanticized version in terms of that's hoping that everybody wants to play ball. That's hoping that everybody's accepting this change, which in a lot of cases, they don't. But once again, this is where, I made a video on this somewhere, I think it was last year, which is around courageous leadership. And the video I made back then was saying part of change and being courageous is also acknowledging that the people who are bucking against change won't be and aren't anonymous. So it's where leadership has to stand up and say, we will not accept this kind of behavior, not just say it, but also enforce it, which is mightily uncomfortable, but still necessary. I keep seeing this one quote over and over again, and, it's talking about beauty in change, but also the discomfort in change. Everyone speaks on the one hand, and it's true, when you get to outcomes, that having teams of different ethnicities, genders are the most successful in terms of outcome. But the other reality is that with multiple cultures, multiple backgrounds, etc., it is very difficult to manage and create cohesion within these teams, which means that the reality is that the management day to day is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult because everybody has a different opinion, a different standpoint, a different experience. So as we're kind of moving towards this point of change, this formula of representation plus influence equals change is also underscored by this will be hard work, but the result will be worth it. If and as long as the infrastructure around these women, Black women, women of color, is such that they are not responsible for so many things, i.e., as I said before, being a representative, being an educator, and also being responsible for the outcome or potential lack of outcome because they haven't been able to fulfill their role. And I think that for me is the most important part. That for me is the critical part of representation. We can't just look at it as a seat at the table. It has to be, how do I facilitate this to be more than just a face? How do I facilitate this to make sure that it is a sustainable change? How do I facilitate this to make sure that this is a long lasting change? Not just, this is something I have done, and because I've done it, we've got this woman of color at this table, my job here is done. Because this is just the beginning. Ultimately, representation without influence and power doesn't change anything. It changes the optics. It's very nice window dressing, but it doesn't address any further deeper issues. And this is for me why quotas are great as a door opener, because they push forward and push through the concept of representation. We need people from these groups to be represented at this table. But then comes the next step. And this is what we have to focus on. Yes, we have our goals. We want to get to this, we want to get to 30% women on boards, because we know it's it's the tipping point in being able to create change from a collective perspective. But in the meantime, potentially and I'm going to credit Adjoa Annim for this, being the lonely only, until we get to that point. I love the phrase lonely only, being the lonely only, until we get to that point of 30% representation, the tipping point. That until we get to that, we still have to work within the parameters that we have. And the parameters that we have potentially are exactly those, right? Supporting that one woman, supporting that one woman of color, supporting that one Black woman. How do we do that? How do we support that lonely only when there are no other defenses, when there are no others within that same room? To be able to still have a level of influence, therefore creating change. And that comes back to the structure of education, clear role definition, making it clear and enforcing that being on board, no pun intended, is not an option, not being on board is not an option. Enforcing those rules and regulations, creating training and workshops around the whys. Why are we here today? Why do we have these inequality? Why, is it the 5 circle of whys or something like that? Using that kind of concept to get to, this is why we are doing it. And more importantly, once again, being very clear as to the role these representatives play within each situation and what the expectations are of those around them. The focus is always on the woman on the board to deliver and radically change the outcomes for the remaining women. But by the same token, we have to also make sure that the spotlight isn't just standing on her, because there's a whole structure behind her that might be preventing her from making any change, because she is a representative face, but she is not a power bearer. So that was just my little, thought and what I wanted to share this morning. And it was nice to be live once again for the first time this year. I share a few of my thoughts, and if you do manage to catch this in the replay, please feel free to kind of give me your thoughts, your feedback. It's always good to kind of hear how it resonates with others and how you feel about it. So what day is it today? Thursday. I want to wish everyone a great Thursday. Thank you as always for tuning in, and I will make sure I will be coming back soon with a live show. Just give me a little bit of time and then we will be here again. So thank you very much and wishing you a wonderful day. Bye-bye.